Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On this week's podcast, we are joined by Barbara Duffield, Executive Director and founder of SchoolHouse Connections, which since 2016 has been advocating and working for stronger efforts to prevent homelessness for students and their families. We discuss the ways that we count youth and family homelessness in America, or more accurately, we talked about the different ways in which we count it across the federal government. We also discussed recent policy changes and proposals out of the Trump administration, some of which she supports and others she definitely does not, and why she thinks much of the federal government's work on family and youth homelessness should move from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to the Department of Health and Human Services. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Barbara Duffield. We are joined today by Barbara Duffield, Executive Director and founder of SchoolHouse Connections, which since 2016 has been advocating and working for stronger efforts to prevent homelessness for students and their families. Barbara, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
It is my pleasure to be here.
And a fellow Michigander, I just learned. I live in Detroit. I'm a transplant. I've been here since 2018. But where are you? Right. Where are you living?
Western. I'm in the Kalamazoo area right now. Yeah.
In the zoo. And you grew up here?
I did. I born and raised, and then went to University of Michigan and then moved to DC. But Kalamazoo is still home.
Awesome. Before we get into the serious topics that we will get into around homelessness, families, and school, let's get these guys to know you a little bit. You're going to have to give me one pick at least in these categories I'm going to give you. You can give me all of them if you want, Barbara, but our pop culture categories are TV show or movie, musical group, book, or sports team. Got to give us one. Can give us as many as you want. What do you got?
I got book. You
got book. Okay.
Yes. So the Murderbot series by Martha Wells is outstanding. And it's basically about a security bot who hacks his governing model and therefore becomes sentient and has awareness. But he's also involved in all sorts of interstellar battles and whatnot. So it's both fun and fast moving and moral complexity, philosophical complexity, high entertainment. So highly recommend the Murderbot series by Martha Wells.
Okay. Murderbots is the recommendation.
Yeah.
Cool. So you have, without dating you here, you've been in this game for a while. You've been working at the intersection of these two things for a long time in a couple of different organizations, but you got your start like tutoring, right?
Yes.
You were on my trajectory. You were going to be a journalist and then you got into this.
Yes, exactly. I was interning at Foreign Policy magazine, and the copy editor asked if I wanted to do some volunteer work with the tutorial project for children who are homeless in DC. So yes, that was the start, was working directly as a tutor for kids who are homeless in DC, and then got into policy and advocacy at a couple of different organizations before co-founding SchoolHouse Connection at the end of 2016. So we'll be almost 10 years. We will be 10 years at the end of this year.
Forgive the bluntness of the question, but why did you choose to start it? You were leading advocacy at another organization. What did you feel needed to be differentiated in the field?
The membership organizations have their place. They're an incredibly important part of the ecosystem in advocacy and implementation. But we thought, and still do, conceive of child and family homelessness and youth homelessness as broader. So while the mission is early care and education, there's so much work that needs to be done in state policy. There's so much work that needs to be done in adjacent sectors, housing, homelessness, that surround education and early care. So it was really a desire to take that mission of overcoming early care, or overcoming homelessness through early care and education, and be much more nimble and broad in how we went about doing it.
Thinking back to your entry point into this in the 90s and compared to now, what would you say, if anything, has changed about the nature of this dynamic of family and youth homelessness, or the characteristics of it? Is it essentially the same, or is the experience of a young person alone or a family homeless out there fundamentally different now than it was decades ago?
There's some things that are the same. The experience of it's grown. That's the first thing I would say is it's much more prevalent. If you look at the data, again, from public schools or early childhood, tremendous growth. And some of the systems around family and youth homelessness have changed. So, for example, in federal law in early childhood and in K-12 education has stronger protections, a little bit more resources. Public schools and early childhood programs understand homelessness better than they did when I was starting out. When I was starting out, it was tutorial programs at shelters, pieces here and there, mostly K-12 focused. So there's been growth in understanding prenatal to post-secondary, and all of those systems have changed in some respects in terms of recognizing the unique harmful impact of homelessness and the need for policy and practice. So that there's been change in the systems, there's been growth overall in the experience of it. And then that some things haven't changed. In particular, the way that the homeless assistance system out of HUD still doesn't recognize child and youth homelessness, still doesn't prioritize it. So some of those issues feel perennial in that you've got a real systems misalignment between how early childhood, K-12, higher ed, and youth services conceive of and work with families and youth, and how the system that's supposed to be designed around to respond does not. So that part is a through line.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I got to say that is like an example of something, as somebody who's involved in journalism in the child welfare and JJ space, I was aware of. But I think in preparing to talk to you and looking at some of the data on your guys' site, I don't think I was fully aware of the chasm. So let's talk about that. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development recently released what they put out year to year, which is this point in time count of homelessness. And it got more headlines than it probably usually does, because this is the first time in a while that overall it's shown a decline. But like you said, when it comes to families, your view, SchoolHouse's view, is that their process for counting who is homeless is just insufficient, and that the schools and education departments have a superior process. Could you like explain that to listeners, just like who's in and out of both of those and why the one is better?
Yeah. So for HUD homeless assistance, we can start with definitions. The HUD homeless assistance, those official point in time counts, which are the ones in the headlines, the ones you will see policymakers and sometimes even advocates talking about, that is a single night in January, who is in shelter and who is visibly identified outside. That's it. So if you weren't in a shelter, or you were not visibly identified by a volunteer on a specific night, you don't get counted. So there's both the limited definition, and there's the fact of what is it actually measuring: shelter capacity and who volunteers could see as homeless. For public schools, early childhood programs, higher education, youth services, there's a broader understanding and a broader definition. So if you are staying with somebody else temporarily because you have nowhere else to go, couch surfing, doubled up, sometimes called that, or you're staying in a motel, regardless of who pays for it, whether you got a charity to pay for it or whether you have a temporary job and you paid for it yourself, motels and staying with other people, not considered homeless, not part of the count. In most communities across the country, there are no shelters. There may not be shelters for youth. There may not be shelters for families. They may be full. Young people and families may be afraid to seek shelter for a number of different reasons. So the most common form of homelessness is this invisible, hidden homelessness, moving around from place to place, staying with whoever will let you stay there temporarily. If you have money for a motel, going there. None of that gets recognized by the HUD point-in-time system. And of course, the schools and early childhood systems are looking at an annual basis. They're not looking at one point in time. They're looking throughout an entire year. So different methodologies, different definitions. But if you can compare the storyline, is it going up or down? They tell very different stories. So this notion that family homelessness went down 11% in 1 year or has gone down over time, you take the same graph with school numbers and you see a different story. And you also see something else. You see the school numbers reflect external events, Hurricane Katrina, the recession, the pandemic. whatever with these things and these like large external dynamics that affect numbers, you see those numbers change. You don't see that for the HUD. It's essentially just a little teeny blip up and down because they're just measuring shelter capacity. And in fact, when you look at the HUD numbers from 2007 to present, it's unchanged because the system hasn't fundamentally changed. So for all of those reasons, you as a policymaker at the local, state, or federal level, you're not getting accurate information about what's actually happening, what the actual trends are, and how many children, youth, and families are actually going through this if you just look at the HUD PID count.
I want to talk more about that because those numbers, are crazy too. I'm going to drop a link to, in particular, a page that's on the SchoolHouse Connection site that's got this kind of chart where you can see the HUD numbers juxtaposed against the homeless student numbers to kind of see what Barbara's talking about. And to her point, that plot's like an 18% decrease over the last 2 decades in family homelessness. But then when you look at the public school data, it's a 136% increase or something like that. So back to that in a minute. What I wanted to ask before we got into that is, it's as you're describing the HUD version, it seems obvious why they'd go that route. It's very simple to do that. I'm not saying it's easy to walk around and count the homeless or do that. That's probably pretty tricky work to do. But you know where to go vaguely. You can do that. Shelters can report numbers. So you get a type. How are schools? The school one sounds complicated. So how are they doing that? And how uniform is that process?
Yeah, it is complicated, but it is, and it's done to varying degrees. Just again, every data source is going to have its limitations. So it's done. The proactive identification is done. There's variation in how it's done but it is a federal requirement. So federal law requires public schools and early childhood programs to proactively identify students who are experiencing homelessness. It requires, for example, every school district to have a homeless liaison who is charged with training school staff about the signs of homelessness, who is also charged with disseminating public notice, putting it out in the community, whether that's laundromats or the front office, motels, waiting rooms, all of those places. They're charged with disseminating public notice. They're also charged with informing families and youth of what their educational rights are. So that proactive identification requirement, how schools actually do it, some schools have questions on enrollment forms. Do you own or rent your own home? Are you staying with somebody temporarily? Are you in a motel? So they'll, at enrollment, have one question, but then proactively training, and that's really where the bulk of the identification happens. The gym teacher who notices someone's coming with the shoes that I'm actually saying that because that's a real example from one of the students in our scholarship program. That's who noticed she was experiencing homelessness. She was showing up to school early and her shoes were falling apart. And so that was the cue. Or a child falling asleep at their desk, or a child talking about moving, or a bus driver who notices a child asking to be picked up or just being picked up at a different spot. So all of these training for school staff are the eyes and the ears of that school liaison, as well as, of course, the relationships with organizations like soup kitchens, libraries, places where families are. So it is complex, but it's being done. And even, again, it kind of gets to a bigger point, which is when the numbers from schools go up, that could be a sign that they're doing a better job identifying, in which case we should say good. The numbers are going up, as opposed to automatically having this knee-jerk reaction. Numbers up is good, numbers down is bad. So I kind of put a couple things into that answer, but the short version is there's a variety of methods, but it needs to be proactive, and it is a legal requirement. As you were describing it, what I was thinking is
preparing to talk to you, I was like, is this a one versus the other thing? HUD's is bad, the schools is good, or not? And obviously it's not, because listening to you describe that, I don't think HUD could possibly do what you just described. So
they're different systems, and what we would advocate for is that all of this be combined together. Assessment report, which is the official report that goes to Congress, just has the HUD numbers. That's all the focus is. That report should include school numbers. It should include Head Start numbers. It should include Runaway and Homeless Youth Act numbers. It should include numbers from any federal program that's collecting data, and present this composite picture and say, this is the picture. And then you can discuss different trends. The public schools are fundamentally different. There's not a shelter bed for every child or youth who needs it. There is a seat in the classroom for every child or youth. There's compulsory education and there's a right to education. So that makes schools a better barometer in that very sense, but it is very different. And both measures need to be looked at together, not just the one. And that's unfortunately where we're at right now.
Yeah, that would make all the sense in the world. Why do you think that hasn't happened? I guess what you're describing is essentially like an interagency report on homelessness every year. So it takes
and that validates every single number. That doesn't call school numbers at risk or however the HUD world typically does, which lessens its severity, it minimizes it, marginalizes it. I think homelessness is still in the public mind and in policymakers' mind an issue for single adults on their own in big cities, and that sort of driving stereotype of what constitutes homelessness and where the greatest needs are, that's part of it. That is where the bulk of federal attention, resources, and efforts has been for that population and not on the other population. So part of it is the system was built around single adults. It wasn't built around children, youth, and families, and that bias stays.
Do you think the public also has that view? I've never seen a survey of public attitudes, but I would bet if you surveyed the public about, is this, essentially just asking, is this homeless? Motels for sure. I think if you described to 100 people, is living week to week in a hotel having a home, or is it homelessness? I think they'd say homelessness. I don't know with living with friends or family. I don't know. And again,
it's that part. I think you're right. I think when we explain to people, and particularly when young people and parents themselves explain, I didn't know when I was going to be asked to leave. This is not me staying in an extra bedroom at grandma. This is me staying with anyone who'll take me in on a floor with my baby, being afraid to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Staying with people where it's not safe. Fundamentally, when you describe that, particularly in rural and suburban areas, then the understanding comes. The challenge is the word homeless has such a pejorative stereotype to it. That word in and of itself becomes a barrier to identification.
Totally. Yeah. So back to these numbers, because I would really just anybody click the link in the show notes and take a look at this because it was really interesting. What it showed to me, check me if you disagree here, what's really stunning is there are, as you noted, like with Katrina and then with COVID later, there's jags. It's not just like one bend all the way up, but it really, at the end of the day, is pretty much just a steady ascent from 650,000 homeless students in 2004 up to 1.5 million in 2018. And then there's kind of that jag down during COVID, right back up to 1.5 million. So it's just been up and up, really. What do you make of the fact that it's not very tethered to things you'd think it would be, like economic trends? We've gone through good and bad times in that time, and it's only gone up. So what's up with that?
It is to a certain extent, right? Because you look at the foreclosure crisis going up. So you do see that. And I do think some of the recent increase, there are other indicators in terms of housing and poverty and other factors, as well as increasing natural disasters. We have to include that as well, that I think contribute to it. And then there's better identification. And so it's impossible to look at this. Correlation is not causation. It's impossible to look at these numbers and say it's one thing or the other things. But I do think it's a coupling of overall worsening trends for families and youth. And secondly, about this work to improve identification, in that you don't see always an immediate change from a policy going into effect and then the change in the numbers, but that emphasis in identification with the 2001 reauthorization and the 2015 reauthorization and increasing training. So I think it's a combination of both, like increasing homelessness and worsening economic conditions and also better identification. The numbers, again, they won't tell you all of those things. I also think it looks different locally, like different depending on what's going on in local economies, that will impact the numbers as well. But nationally, probably those two things are both true.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to dig down and see where there might be places that exacerbate this a lot, because it's just hard to get your head. Another one of those metrics that there's one way or another way, like supplemental poverty measures and just straight poverty. When you really factor in supplemental poverty, as the New York Times and Child Trends has kind of surfaced, we've just gotten a lot better at holding poverty down in a way you would think would at some point have correlated to less homeless students. And it looked like from the arc of it, the one time it seemed like we were starting to move the needle downward was like right before COVID.
And
right.
But again, what happened right before then? So 2017 was a high mark because there were 3 hurricanes that year. Right? You had Maria, I'm forgetting them now. There were 3 hurricanes. Rita, Maria, and I forget the third one. So that led to that spike. So it wasn't a decrease so much as it wasn't a hurricane year. And that part of this conversation is this is complex. Homeless complex. It's not one thing. So anytime you hear someone say housing ends it or whatever, insert your solution here, it's all of the things combining together for some of the most vulnerable youth and families in our country. So deep poverty for children, all of these factors are part of the story. But yeah, it's complex. And so again, anyone that tries to oversimplify it, whether it's a policy or an advocate or media, is not looking at the full picture.
Yeah. The one that you called out, there's a very, as you'll see if you look at the chart, there's a very defined spike with Hurricane Katrina, which obviously displaced hundreds of thousands of people around New Orleans and coastal Louisiana and Mississippi. It was actually, I was looking at it, I was like, man, we collectively recovered very quickly from that, because it goes from 600 to 900,000 and then back down. And I was just thinking, wow, that actually was an instance where we had a very hyper-local crisis that seemed to be addressed on some level.
And this is where you say, okay, so
now you're giving me the bad news. Like,
yeah. So some families did get housed, so they didn't show up as homeless. But if you look, for example, at Louisiana's number, and yes, it was hyper-local, but children were displaced across the country. Schools were enrolling displaced children under McKinney-Vento from coast to coast. But if you look at Louisiana's numbers over that time period, you see very slow decrease, because for some families that precipitating event lasted, and so that their homelessness may not have shown up that particular year, but 2 years later it did. So there's complexity there. And the other thing too, besides external events like natural disasters or pandemics, there is policy choices that are made too. So part of the story too, if you look at the HUD numbers and the decline around 2011 or so, HUD did 2 things. It defunded transitional housing, which is categorized as homeless, and shifted funding into rapid rehousing, which is considered housed. So many families were in transitional housing. So that decline over that time period also reflects a choice in policy that HUD made to defund transitional housing, which it categorized as homeless, and put families into another time-limited program. Rapid rehousing is also time-limited, and call that housed. So that's another thing. You can peel back for schools, the requirements around identification, but you also need to peel back for HUD policy changes that it made in terms of how the programs it funded and how it characterized them.
Yeah, it's a lovely segue that you just made on behalf of me, because that was the next thing I was going to ask you about. Is like, we're talking numbers, there's counting, and then there's practice. And your guys' view is clear that shift over time from transitional to rapid disadvantaged families. So let's start with this. Just explain a little bit more than you just did what those 2 things are, what the characteristics of transitional and rapid rehousing are, and why the latter is disadvantageous for families in the continuum of homeless services.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that it's disadvantageous in and of itself. I would say that there needs to be a number of options for families based on their needs. And when you take away one option and you just put everybody into another option, that's the problem. So to back up a little bit, transitional housing, time limited, comes with intensive services, typically with the aim for somebody to leave that program model and be able to not be homeless again. So typically it's, again, 2 years, involves case management, a variety of different services, and with, again, the goal of not become homeless. Rapid rehousing, also time limited, 2 years, but typically rather than a program holding the lease, it's in the family's own name. So the idea is you're here temporarily, you're going to be able to take over this lease at some point in time. Services more optional, less intensive. So for some families that may be appropriate. They may be able to, in 2 years' time, take over that lease at market rent. But for many families, that's not going to be possible without intensive services. In fact, what happens is they can't maintain it. They get evicted again. Now they're homeless twice. Now they got an eviction on their record, and nothing's been done to address all the other needs around childcare or parental education and employment or anything else that's going on. So for some families, particularly families headed by young people or young people themselves, having a model where you're getting intensive support and then that's helping you then to be able to take on a lease by yourself would be a better long-term solution than one that's like you're out. And the evidence that many families they're not going necessarily from rapid rehousing to and staying on. If they can't maintain the lease, then they're going to another doubled up situation or another homeless situation of those sorts. So it's all about the right interventions for the right families. And when you take out one option and you put everybody in your state, you're just going to do one of these two, that's where you have problems. And that's what we see right now.
And so that is what began in 2011 is just I don't want to overstate it, but defunding transitional to.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was defunded. It was like, these programs will not be funded. They're going to go out of the top priority. Instead, this is what you got. You got rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing, most families can't qualify for because you have to be chronically homeless. And because the definition of homelessness, they're just never going to meet that threshold, or it's rare for them to meet that threshold.
This was actually weirdly in the rare vortex of my life when I wasn't really paying attention because I had just left Youth Today. Rest in peace at that version of Youth Today, and then starting this up. So I don't remember this at all. What's the history here? Why did it happen? Was this something that was driven by the Obama administration late in there?
Concert with certain advocates, right? In concert, what I would call industry advocates who are really, and the ideology is housing ends homelessness. So all families really need is some short-term housing assistance. That's it. So if you define the primary, if not the only cause of homelessness as housing, and you say families don't have really complex needs, then you come up with a solution, which is a short-term housing subsidy, and that's it. So it was ideological in the sense of really focusing on that aspect of it, and having seen in the recession and the foreclosure crisis that for some families for whom their homelessness was primarily economic, that was successful, but over-applied to all families, including young families. So that was the genesis of it, and it is stuck.
And what you're describing is generally referred to as housing first. Is that
Housing first is different in the sense that housing first is more the philosophy that there should be no preconditions. There should be no preconditions to entering or maintaining in a housing program. So it's easy to see because they both happened at the same time, but they're actually two different things.
Okay, I see. Because this administration seems to be very critical and wanting to move away from housing first. But are you not seeing them move away from what you are criticizing here? The prioritization of rapid?
There is an attempt. Again, I would argue that we went from one extreme to another, and that there's a middle ground that's been, or maybe it's not middle, but more to one side. But the pendulum swung from one piece out to the other. So there is a move right now to more incentivized transitional housing and supportive services, which we know are critical for families and youth, and to back off from rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. That is part of what this administration is looking for. And that would be welcome from a number of providers, both in the youth and family space. However, there are all sorts of other things that are a part of that shift that are less welcome. I'll just say that.
Nobody said adoption and foster care were easy, but it's easier when you're not alone. The Families Rising Adoption and Foster Care Conference brings together hundreds of adoptive, foster, and kinship parents, lived experts, and child welfare professionals. Together, we'll talk about the tough stuff in child welfare, bring hope to our kids and families, and of course, earn CEUs while we do it. Let's get refreshed and re-energized to serve kids and families in need. All at the virtual Families Rising Adoption and Foster Care Conference on October 21st and 22nd. Register today and take advantage of our early bird rates at wearefamiliesrising.org/conference. That's wearefamiliesrising.org/conference.
Yeah, so one of those probably, I'm going to guess, is the idea to block grant up all of the education money and put McKinney-Vento as an option.
Yeah,
So,
that's separate, two different agencies,
yeah.
but yeah.
I just wanted to ask you something else about McKinney-Vento because honestly, I just don't think that's likely. They put that proposal out 2 years in a row, and
the House has rejected it. The conservative House majority has rejected that proposal.
Yep.
So
yeah,
McKinney-Vento is intact.
Yeah, and safe to say that's the preeminent law on this intersection of education and homelessness.
Yes.
For those who don't know, which probably a lot of our listeners do generally know, it's requiring states to make efforts to keep kids in the school that they want to go to, that they're transported there, all that. It's foster youth and homeless youth. Now, you guys create a lot of resources for these liaisons in the schools. I imagine you do some training too in person. What do you think? How old is McKinney-Vento now? It's like 80s, right? Late 80s?
87.
Okay.
So it's, it'll be, next year it'll be.
Oh, you got an anniversary to celebrate.
Yeah, big one.
That's always a good one. It's that many years old. Where do you think McKinney-Vento has succeeded, and where has implementation, in your mind, maybe been stunted all these years or not lived up to the promise?
I definitely think the fact, again, that the pillars of McKinney-Vento, proactive identification, being able to stay in the same school, even if your housing situation changes, being able to be immediately enrolled in school if you do have to change schools, the extension into preschool, and the focus on transition to higher ed. I think all of those have fundamentally shifted the fabric of the way schools should be approaching McKinney-Vento and implementing it. Challenges still are lack of awareness, and lack of resources. Right now, McKinney-Vento funding is $129 million for the entire country. What that means is only 1 out of every 5 school districts actually gets a McKinney-Vento subgrant. We saw things change during the pandemic when there was $800 million over 3 years, significant increase, and over half of all school districts were able to get some money to specifically identify and support students who are experiencing homelessness. So I think that the challenges of awareness and resources are still those two big pieces, and they go hand in hand. They really do.
Yeah. How has the actual liaison piece of it gone? The reason I ask is because I was actually just kind of looking through a recent assessment of post-secondary education opportunities for foster youth in Texas. And one of the things they surfaced, because basically the point of it was, we've got one of the most robust tuition waivers in the country, and yet 5% of foster youth or some crazy low number were getting degrees. What is going on? And one of the things they surfaced was that they were supposed to have liaisons, right? They're supposed to be helping these kids stay on campus, but it's a lot of, even the school staff described it as a side gig. Have we seen that with McKinney-Vento, or are you by and large actually seeing people dedicated at a lot of school districts to doing this?
Again, this is where the resources conversation is very relevant. You will more likely have full-time McKinney-Vento liaisons where you have a subgrant, where you actually get funding for it, or where federal Title I law, education for the disadvantaged, Title I Part A, over $18 billion. School districts are required to set aside dollars which can fund the liaison. So we do see more capacity and more FTE associated with liaisons where there's a subgrant, where there's a robust Title I set aside, and where there's not, then it's more other duties as assigned, and it's one thing, and that absolutely remains a challenge, particularly right now because of everything else that's happening. Right, public education, McKinney-Vento doesn't happen in isolation from everything else that's happening in public education. So declining enrollment in public schools in many parts of the country means declining revenue for public education. And so where we see staff being laid off or schools being closed down because of the changes in public school enrollment, that's going to impact McKinney-Vento students as well. So again, complexity, it's not, you can't just say, how's McKinney-Vento doing, and not ask, how is public education doing?
Yeah, no, totally fair. Have you seen in these situations where you've got maybe one school district next to another and one has a grant, the other doesn't, or whatever, have you seen states get creative about this, where they're trying to get a full-time at least to cover 2, instead of it being like 1/3 of a bunch of people's jobs in different places?
There are some places where they have consortia, or an intermediate unit, whether it's a county office of education or there's called intermediate units depending on or educational service agencies. Different states have different names, but essentially more of a regional unit who takes the lead and tries to make sure that those districts that don't have subgrants are in the fold. Definitely some states that are incentivizing training and certification, so that that you actually get clock hours or other certifications if you attend the McKinney-Vento training, regardless of your subgrant status. So all of those things are happening to various degrees across the country.
Cool. We'll stipulate that you think there should be more money. So is there another thing you'd want changed or added to McKinney-Vento on its 40th birthday if they decided to take it up?
One of the things that and it goes hand in hand with the more resources, but one of the things that we saw in the pandemic, because there was more funding, was the Department of Education became clear about all the ways in which funds could be used. And so things, for example, driver's ed, car repair, insurance store cards, which was a huge thing that was considered to be new in the pandemic. And then the department said that was allowable. We just didn't say it before. So the flexibility of the funding, and even to be able to use the funds for a couple of days to put a family in a motel, that was new in the pandemic as well. And that was reported by schools to be so helpful, because if you could do those things, help a family meet an immediate need, not only did it increase their showing up to school, but it also built trust between, and particularly in the pandemic when trust was one of the casualties between parents and schools and young people, to be able to have that. So that, I would say, the resources and then the flexibility to use the resources in ways that meet parents and youth needs directly, obviously related to school, that those two things, I would say, flexibility and more resources.
Yeah, I don't think I really probably have appreciated, obviously, the school closures around COVID were tough for everybody involved and led to a lot of difficult decisions and feelings about, how long should this go on, and everything that went with it. But just how particularly tough this was on kids in the circumstance we're talking about here, who, in the best case circumstance, maybe they're living at a hotel or motel or something like that. School is an outsized boon to that situation.
Absolutely. The safest, most stable place where they could be reliably get food, reliably have an adult looking over their shoulder, structure allowed to be just like everybody else in that situation, really like a second home. And with school closures, that was lost. Communication was lost. Liaisons lost touch with families who were moving around. I think even now we hear about liaisons who are enrolling students who've been out for a number of years, and that was the beginning of the unraveling. So it's going to take a while to recover from that. But that was absolutely devastating.
So we go from a 40-year-old law to a new one that's not even a law yet. There's a bill on the table, probably first introduction this year, from Senators Murkowski in Alaska and Murray from Washington, that would put, I think it's $105 million into play, as I read it, to experiment or support community solutions prevention work. So a little more upstream than McKinney-Vento. I'm assuming you support that bill. I actually think you probably commented on it.
I did indeed.
Yeah. So I guess my question to you is, what do you want to see? Let's fast forward to where, if it passes and that money goes out the door, what kinds of things would you encourage recipients to do with it? What do you want to see experimented with, or the evidence built for?
I would, particularly the role of schools, again, sound like a broken record here. Schools are mentioned in that legislation, they're part of it, but I think really centering schools in prevention efforts, because again, there's no other institution in a community that has the same view, that is really that hub for seeing children prior to a crisis occurring and then throughout that crisis. So definitely would want to see that. I also would want to see more recognition of the connection to youth and families. Oftentimes the conversations around youth homelessness are about youth, and almost as if the family they came from was an aside. More work in making sure that we're looking at the whole family, youth, parents, siblings. I would like to see more of that emphasis as well.
There's been two recent policy updates, let's call them, pretty significant ones in the space that we're talking about, but with you today, Barbara. And one of those is with McKinney-Vento, which is like, we've already talked about it on this podcast. That's a governing legislation around federal policy on homeless youth and education, and then also to the Head Start program. So let's take them one at a time, talk to our listeners about what is significant. And why don't you explain the changes as for a layperson and what your view of these changes are? So let's start with McKinney-Vento, though.
Sure. So in early August, the U.S. Department of Education sent out a letter from the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education to chief state school officers, letting them know that McKinney-Vento funds can be used for short-term temporary emergency housing on a case-by-case basis with other conditions that are specified. This is tremendous. It is something that school districts were able to do during the pandemic when we had a lot more funding, when there was $800 million in funding, and it allowed school districts to respond to immediate crises. So a call on a Friday at 3 p.m., nowhere for a family to go, don't know where they're going to be on Monday. The school district able to put the family in a motel, for example, for over the weekend. So the child was safe, the children are safe, they're connected to school, the bus knows where to go on Monday, and they can get connected to longer term housing solutions. Because if a government or charity pays for a motel room, then you're eligible for HUD homeless assistance. So this is something that the department had said would not apply to regular McKinney-Vento funds, but now has said that it will apply to regular McKinney-Vento funds, and also reissued the entire non-regulatory guidance for McKinney-Vento, which is a very significant document for school districts. And so both of those coming out are very welcomed by our field because they allow school districts to have some flexibility in meeting short-term crises to stabilize children in school. And they also put out the guidance for a lot of people who've never seen it before because it's not been updated since 2018. So having that updated guidance more generally about the McKinney-Vento program, I think, is very affirming for school districts, particularly right now, in terms of upholding McKinney-Vento rights. So that is a very welcome and exciting piece of news.
So now, just so I'm understanding it correctly, because I think you said that this came in the form of a letter. Usually when they're sending a letter to states, it's the official policy document equivalent of saying, we're just telling you our view of what the law already says. Correct. Is that the case? So people like you and others have long felt that they could be using this money for the housing.
That's exactly correct, because under the McKinney-Vento Act, the statute, one of the authorized uses of funds is extraordinary assistance to enable homeless children and youth to attend. And so essentially what they're saying is this is consistent with the law because it's extraordinary assistance needed to allow children to be able to enroll, to attend school. So the letter came out, and then again, the entire non-regulatory guidance came out with this added to it. So it was a letter plus, and both of those things are very significant.
It's one of the more endemic problems in federal policy, right? That somehow some people get it in their head that you can't do something, and then that spreads like telephone, like the game. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, wait, I thought we couldn't do this. We better send a letter telling you can't.
Yeah. And school districts, they were told that you can't. It wasn't. Yeah. In this instance, they were told this was allowable with the pandemic funds. It is no longer allowable with regular funds. So they were explicitly told yes for pandemic funds, no for regular. So this is a shift in the interpretation of what's allowable, and it comes at a really important time. Now, I also have to say that, as we talked about, only 1 in 5 school districts gets McKinney-Vento funds because of the overall low funding level. Yeah. So it's not going to benefit every district, every child. But for those who do get McKinney-Vento funds, this could be a tremendous way to stabilize families.
It's almost more important now, right? For all of the many problems that we had during COVID, actually would say in some ways it was unprecedented housing stability. There were protections against people getting kicked out of their house
Again, in the pandemic, if you were doubled up, if you were staying with somebody else, you got kicked out.
Yeah.
For our population, those protections didn't have the same force.
Very fair. Yeah.
And the only way you could social distance is in a motel. You can't social distance on someone's couch.
Okay, so that's McKinney-Vento. And then I think probably every person listening to this podcast is at least somewhat aware of the major change to Head Start policy that was announced a couple of weeks ago. I think probably by the time you hear this podcast, you can read about that anywhere. We'll also, the imprint, be covering sort of the more specific proximity of the Head Start program and those changes to child welfare and youth homelessness and some of the issues that we cover. But Barbara, why don't you explain to listeners, just give them the overview on what's changed that you feel is most salient to these populations?
Sure. Again, for listeners to understand, this is a proposed rule.
Yes.
So Nothing has happened yet. We are in a 60-day comment period.
And just as somebody who dorkily reads a lot of NPRM's proposed notices, I think, let's put it this way, I'm curious if you agree. I think sometimes you read them and there's always the pro forma, you have 60 days to comment on it. But the way they're written, it's like, this is a done deal. I kind of feel like there's a chance they're going to hear from, I think in particular, Head Start program managers, like people directly involved in operating them. There may be room for this because it's a very big change. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I also agree with that. I think we're already seeing concerns from both sides of the aisle and a lot of advocacy because it does amount to essentially fundamentally changing the program. It would be a different program if these rules were to be promulgated and finalized. For children who are experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, there are very profound changes. The stated intent was to simplify and reduce burden, to reduce the number of regulations because they're already in the statute. But the statute, the actual Head Start Act, says the secretary has to issue regulations to establish policies and procedures to make sure that children who are homeless are identified and prioritized for enrollment, that they're allowed to enroll while documentation is being obtained, and that there's coordination with McKinney-Vento liaisons. The law doesn't execute itself. It doesn't just happen. So how Head Start programs identify children who are homeless, how they prioritize them, how they enroll them, all of that spelled out in the regulations.
Can I ask on that point, and don't take this as me being for or against this regulation, how are programs doing on that now? And I mean that in two ways. How literally are they doing it generally? And how are they performing on that metric?
Yes, excellent question. So, for example, the current rules, the current performance standards say that Head Start programs have to actively recruit families who are experiencing homelessness, have to prioritize them for enrollment, have to actively identify. How does that actually happen is your question, just for that particular piece. So outreach to motels, outreach to shelters, questions on enrollment forms about, are you experiencing homelessness? Being able to accept a family coming in and saying, basically, hey, I'm staying with somebody else, that self-attestation, that is how families are being identified. That is how they are, quote unquote, proving that they're homeless so that they can be eligible for the program. How are they being prioritized? There's got to be a community needs assessment. And if you're experiencing homelessness or you're in foster care, extra points. So you go higher onto the waiting list. That is how that's actually happening. And for both children who are homeless and for children who are in foster care, programs have the ability under the current rules to hold slots for families who come in in the middle of the year. Children under foster care, they become homeless all different times of the year. If the program's full, there's essentially no way for those highly mobile children to get in. So under the current regulations, it's a way of prioritizing. It's a way of removing barriers. You can hold up to 3% of your funded enrollment for children who are homeless in foster cares, and you could hold it for up to 30 days, then you have to release the seat. That's the mechanism. The regs take all of that away. All of that is removed. So you essentially have a pressure to have a fully enrolled classroom, but no stated ability to get in a child who's highly mobile, who comes in after the year. You don't have the ability for a family who's fleeing domestic violence to come in and share that situation and be considered homeless, because families would be specifically prohibited from self-attestation. So families in rural areas where there aren't any shelters, families who are moving around a lot, families fleeing domestic violence, they don't have a piece of paper saying they're homeless. And that in and of itself creates a tremendous barrier. So we are very concerned that this program, which is a true two-generation program that could actually permanently resolve homelessness for families is no longer going to be able to actually accommodate them. And some of the same barriers that led Congress to put this in the law in the first place are presented all over again.
What is your sense, or maybe we have specifics on this, do we know how many children who have the status of homeless participate in Head Start every year? I think on the foster care side, we know that it's a lower rate than the population in general of low-income kids, which I think there's probably some reasons for it. But with the homeless population, do we have some idea about the universe? Yeah.
In the last program year, if we were looking at both Head Start and early Head Start, over 60,000 children experiencing homelessness were enrolled, 60,221 to be exact. That is about 9.5% of the enrollment in early Head Start overall. So basically 1 in every 10 children enrolled in early Head Start was identified as experiencing homelessness. And for the regular Head Start program, it's about 7% of total enrollment identified as experiencing homelessness.
Okay. I'm curious how you feel about, we've honed in on a very specific corner of a bigger package of things they're proposing to change that deals with prioritizing homeless youth and tracking them and identifying them. I would say the most consequential broad changes they're making are to the ratio of Head Start teachers to kids, things that deal with how many kids would be in this in general. And I'm just curious how your view on those, because I think they are, the administration, presenting this as there's 250,000 slots to be had if we can make this a little more of a simple program with less burden, is what they say in the rules. So that obviously doesn't have anything to do with any specific population. I'm just curious your view on that part of it, because it has gone down. We're a couple 100,000 less than peak with Head Start participation.
The conversation about Head Start is taking place with a lot of shifts within early childhood,
right?
The childhood system. So the two have to be looked at in concert. But quality matters. Quality matters for young children. It matters for children who are homeless. It matters for children who are in foster care. So some of those pieces that are about really changing what is considered quality program and comprehensive services, we have to be very concerned about, because some of the children who have the greatest risk for developmental delays and other long-term developmental impacts are the ones who need that quality standard. And those are some of the pieces that are also proposed to be removed. So we're concerned about all of it. Our focus, just simply because children who are homeless or in foster care may not be getting in at all. And so we're focused on both pieces.
So not to get ahead of it, I'm sure you guys are crafting a response to this, but is it going to be as simple as don't do any of these things, or are you planning to provide some suggestions on different ways to come at this?
We're planning on providing different suggestions. I think the performance standards are 10 years old. We've learned a lot about how programs do or don't implement them and why. So I think it would be a missed opportunity to not suggest changes that actually strengthen and improve the ability of Head Start programs to enroll and keep enrolled families who are homeless and those who have involvement in child welfare. So we'll be very thoughtful in our comments.
Moving from things that have actually been proposed to just big picture, I want you to give me two things. One, give me an outside the box idea for addressing youth and family homelessness that nobody or almost nobody has tried. Just something that you've been cooking in your head. And then what's the biggest, just no-brainer program that just gets not nearly enough funding? You see it and you're just like, why are we're idiots for not, this should be $1 billion for this.
Definitely McKinney-Vento is in the second one, because that one is the fact that we have almost 4%. What was it? 3.5%. It'll soon be close to 4% of K-12 students identified as experiencing homelessness, which means they're much more. And McKinney-Vento is a fraction of the K-12 budget. So that's the one that absolutely, and again, people still can't even pronounce McKinney-Vento. So it's not known about. It doesn't get the recognition that it should. We saw that, right, with the pandemic funding. Yeah. Not only did we identify more kids, but chronic absence went down and graduation went up, even in that short period, by a small amount. But nonetheless, that's one where absolutely a greater investment would have an outsized impact.
But just to be clear, because I want to hear you're outside the box, so I can lay on that. Yeah, I know. I can see that you're excited about that. Would a surge in resources for McKinney-Vento have the ability to prevent this or better assist the youth? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would say
we've had McKinney-Vento and it's going up and up, which is not the law's fault, but it's.
And again, we see there's an argument to be made that 10 years ago, the numbers were the same as they are. We just didn't know, and there wasn't outreach. So the numbers going up and up, again, I think it's complicated. It's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, particularly, again, if we're identifying students and getting them into school and they're graduating, that right there is prevention. Right there is prevention. I do think that a sustained, not one time, but a sustained increase in resources coupled with flexibility, you would see in the long term decreases in homelessness, because we know that lack of a high school degree or GED is the single greatest risk factor for experiencing homelessness as a young adult. So yes, that would be a smart move for both prevention and solving immediate crises. Now, out of the box.
Let's go.
We need a new federal program for families experiencing homelessness that is in the Administration for Children and Families at HHS. Decades of working on this issue, decades of seeing the continual resistance to consider families homeless who are homeless, to focus on children as human beings with their own needs. There's no outcome measures for HUD programs on kids, from babies to youth. That I think a new federal program at ACF for children, youth, and families that had the broader definition that went directly from the federal government to community-based agencies, and that had actual metrics that were about children and family well-being, that's the shift that has to happen. I don't think the HUD homeless system is ever going to acknowledge the realities of families and youth, in part because of the intransigence of industry advocates, frankly. And so it's time to do something different. And that something different is to house a program at an agency that has children and families in its name, that has childcare, that has Head Start, that has DV programs, that has runaway and homeless youth programs, that has child welfare, and it has a vision that isn't just having a roof over your head, but of economic mobility and self-sufficiency. A different vision, a different agency with a different population focus. That's the shift that needs to happen if we're ever going to look at really moving the needle.
When you say industry advocates, I want to make sure, what do you mean by that?
Organizations like the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who have historically defended the HUD homelessness systems, its definitions, its outcomes, and its priorities for single adults.
Barbara Duffield, founder and executive director of SchoolHouse Connections. Thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.